The stars above Cadia were not as they had been. Once they had burned clean and sharp, their light cutting through the void like spears of the Emperor's own wrath. Now they seemed to sag in their brilliance, dimmed by an unseen haze. Beyond the constellations, in the unblinking dark, the eye of terror swelled like a malignant wound, its colors wrong, its motion unnatural. Even from the fortress walls one could see it boil and churn, spilling madness into the void. It was said that when the eye flared, worlds died, and in these days it flared often. But before I speak of the great ending, before we drown in the sorrow of Cadia's fall, I will say this to you. We are glad you are here. You matter to this telling as much as the heroes and the doomed souls who marched into fire. This story is not only about death and ruin, but about why we fight, why we endure, and why loss still carries meaning. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The wind clawed over the high bastions of Casa Partox, dragging with it the metallic tang of distant battlefields. From his vantage atop the wall, Lord Castellan Melric Varn could see the endless plain of Cadia's surface, scarred, blackened, cratered. In the far distance, the glow of artillery illuminated the horizon in fitful flashes. War had become the natural rhythm of this place, a heartbeat measured in bombardments and death counts. Varn's face was carved from stone, yet his eyes betrayed the fatigue of decades without reprieve. His hair was iron grey, his jaw set like the walls he defended. Duty had been his anchor for nearly 40 years, but of late, that anchor felt more like a chain. Another convoy lost, came the voice of Colonel Serath, his second in command. She held a data slate, its screen washed in static. South Ridge supply run, gone before they cleared the ridgeline. No survivors. Varn didn't turn his head. Traitors or Chaos Raiders? Serath hesitated. Unknown. But the enemy moved before the convoy entered known attack zones. Someone leaked their route. There it was again. The quiet, crawling sickness that had been growing in Cadia's gut for months. Betrayal. Not in the form of enemy blades or bolter fire, but in whispers, in corrupted oaths, in soldiers turning their weapons upon their brothers. Varn had long suspected it would come to this. The Cadian gate had held against the Eye of Terror for millennia, but walls could not keep out doubt. It was in the High Lord's empty promises, in the lack of reinforcements, in the faces of young recruits who knew they'd never see home again. "Seal the barracks at Casa Myrak," Varn said at last. "Nobody enters or leaves without my mark." Serath nodded, but lingered. "Sir, this is the 4th sabotage in as many weeks. If this keeps up..." "It will keep up," Varn cut, in his voice low. "Until the end. This is how a world dies, Colonel. Not in a single blow, but in the slow rot that eats its spine." Beneath them, the fortress stirred. Marching boots clattered on steel gantries. Vox traffic buzzed in clipped exchanges. And somewhere in the armory, the low growl of engines signaled another armored column preparing to move out. Cadia did not pause. Cadia could not pause. And yet, Varn felt the stillness growing in himself, an icy clarity that whispered of inevitability. He remembered his youth, the first time he'd looked into the eye. His instructor had told him never to stare too long, that the warp had ways of staring back. But he had stared, defiant and curious. He had seen shapes moving in the storm, titanic and alien, locked in an endless, silent war. For a heartbeat, he had felt as if time itself bent around him, as if the centuries were nothing more than grains of sand swirling in an hourglass. It had been beautiful, and it had terrified him. Now, decades later, he felt that same bending of time. The war was no longer an event, it was the only truth left. The people of Cadia were born into battle and died in battle, their lives as brief and bright as muzzle flashes. The Imperium called them eternal defenders, but eternity had a cost. A low tremor rattled the battlements beneath his boots. Varn's gaze snapped eastward. Over the ridgeline, a thick, unnatural fog was rolling in. Not weather, but something else. The fog shimmered faintly, shot through with threads of color that didn't belong to any spectrum a mortal eye should see. Serath swore under her breath. Warp breach. Varn didn't answer. He was already raising his vox to issue the alarm when the first psychic tremor hit. It wasn't sound or sight, but a pressure inside the skull, a vice that tightened until his vision swam. Around him, guardsmen staggered, some clutching their heads, others staring blankly as if their thoughts had been wiped clean. And then came the voice. It wasn't heard so much as felt, a deep, resonant pulse that crawled through bone and marrow. The walls are paper, the gate is ash. Varn gritted his teeth, forcing the words out past the ringing in his ears. Hold the lines! No one breaks rank. But even as he spoke, he felt the truth in the voice's venom. The fortress was strong. The soldiers were loyal. But somewhere, within the command itself, there was a crack, a fracture that no steel could mend. Far above, the Eye of Terror flared, casting its unholy light over the battlements. For an instant, Varn thought he saw the shape of a colossal hand, pressing outward against the fabric of reality, its fingers clawing for purchase. The wind rose, carrying with it a distant sound. Not artillery, not engines, but laughter, cold and certain. And deep within, Lord Castellan Varn knew the end had already begun. The fog had not lifted by morning. It clung to the bastion walls like a living, sheath thing, coiling through embrasures, filling every hollow with its shifting glow. Men on the night watch spoke in hushed tones about shapes moving in the mist. Some swore they saw figures in blackened armor, others the silhouettes of their own fallen comrades, beckoning from beyond the ramparts. The quartermasters began issuing double rations of recaf to keep troops awake, but no amount of caffeine could banish the unease. Inside the central keep, the air was heavy with incense and static crackle from the astropathic choir. Their minds reached outward through the warp, trying to cut through the psychic smog that now blanketed the planet. No messages from the Segmentum Command had broken through in 3 days. Lord Castellan Varn stood at the head of the War Council chamber, a long oaken table before him covered in maps, data slates, and hololithic projections. The walls were lined with banners, each one a captured chaos sigil, blackened and defaced, trophies of Cadia's defiance. But today, their presence felt less like pride and more like warning. Around the table sat the fortress world's most vital minds. Colonel Serath, always rigid in posture, her storm-grey eyes betraying nothing. Inquisitor Tholric, lean and hawk-faced, his rosette gleaming like a brand of judgment. Commissar Drain, whose silence was more dangerous than any outburst. And finally, Captain Vera, a decorated veteran of the Kastrikin elite, and one of Varn's most trusted aides. We've confirmed sabotage, Serath began, her voice flat. The Southern Gun Array's munitions stockpile was intentionally overprimed. Whoever did it knew exactly how to cause maximum collateral. Traitors within the walls, Thalric said, his voice sharp as flint. Not the rabble, officers. Someone high enough to know the defense protocols. Varn's jaw tightened. And yet your interrogations yield nothing. Thalric's eyes narrowed, Interrogations take time. Even here, the taint is subtle. If you wish me to begin culling entire regiments, I can... You'll do no such thing. Varn cut him off. Purge panic into the ranks, and you'll hand the enemy the victory without a shot fired. Vera leaned forward. Sir, with respect, we can't afford half measures. The Black Legion's probing our flanks every night. The warp storms are worsening, and now our own people are crippling us. If the traitor isn't dealt with, they will be, Varn said, but his gaze flickered for the briefest instant toward Vera. That flicker was not lost on Serath. The War Council dissolved an hour later, but its echo remained in Varn's mind. Thalric's eyes cold and calculating, Serath's silence more accusing than words. And Vera? No, he dismissed the thought. She had saved his life twice over the years. She had stood on the walls at Keldrin Pass until her armor ran red. But trust was a fragile thing now, and the warp's whispers had a way of twisting even the surest loyalties. Later, in his private quarters, Varn reviewed the casualty logs from the last month. The pattern was there if one looked. Supply runs failing in specific sectors, power relays collapsing just before assaults, Vox links dying mid-operation, always in ways that weakened Cadia's outer defenses, never the inner bastions. The pattern formed a circle, a tightening noose. A coded knock pulled him from the data slate. Serath stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Sir, I thought you should see this. She placed a palm-sized holo recorder on his desk. The projection flickered to life, showing grainy footage from the east wall. A group of Cadian shock troops moved in silence, their faces obscured by helmets. They approached an ammunition stockpile, and one of them planted a device at the base of a crate. The image sharpened just long enough to reveal the markings on the saboteur's pauldron. Kasrkin. Varn felt the cold sink into him. Only a handful of Kasrkin squads were on Cadia at present, and Captain Vera commanded them all. Where did you get this? Varn asked quietly. A loyal Vox operator on night duty, Serath said. I've confirmed its authenticity. Have you shown this to anyone else? Serath shook her head. Not yet. I came to you first. Varn stared at the recording for a long moment. The figure's movements were precise, professional. Not the work of a corrupted fanatic, but of someone trained to perfection. Someone who knew Cadia's defenses like the back of their own hand. The thought cut deeper than he cared to admit. Keep this to yourself for now, he said at last. No accusations, not until we're certain. Serath's voice lowered. With respect, sir, certainty is a luxury we may not have. If Vera is compromised, the longer we wait... I said not yet, Varn snapped. Serath held his gaze for a heartbeat, then gave a curt nod and left. When the door closed, Varn sank into the chair. The Eye of Terror's glow spilled faintly through the window slit, painting his hands in sickly color. He wondered if the warp could reach into a man's mind without him knowing. If it could plant a seed so deep that even the victim would believe themselves loyal. Until the day they were not. The fog outside thickened as night fell again. Patrols moved like wraiths along the wall, their outlines swallowed by the gloom. And somewhere in that shifting veil, Varn thought he saw the faint outline of a figure watching the fortress. Tall, armored, unmoving. When he blinked, it was gone. In the War Council chamber, miles of stone away, Captain Vera stood alone at the table. Her gauntleted fingers traced the lines of Cadia's defense grids, her eyes fixed on a sector to the southeast. She did not look up when the shadows in the far corner seemed to stir. You're late, she murmured. A voice answered from the darkness. Smooth, cold, almost amused. The game moves as we will it. Your part is nearly done. Vera's jaw clenched. I've given you what you asked. The outer defenses will fall within the week. After that, the voice interrupted. You will stand aside. The gate will open, and Cadia will be dust. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table. And my men? The darkness chuckled. All flesh is expendable. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, the corner was empty. By dawn, Varn had given new orders. Triple guard on the southern walls, every munitions cache under armed watch. But even as the orders went out, he could feel the enemy's hand already inside the fortress. It wasn't a matter of if the breach would come. It was a matter of when. And when it did, he feared the first blow would not come from the Black Legion outside the walls, but from the soldiers standing beside him. The first shells fell before dawn. Their distant whine built into a scream that ended in a bone-deep concussion, shaking dust from the vaulting of the fortress keep. The alarms wailed seconds later, an angry, keening tone that sent soldiers scrambling from their bunks, bolters in hand. The Black Legion was testing the southern walls again. Lord Castellan Varn was already on the battlements when the second barrage hit. The horizon bloomed with fire, shadows flickering in the fog like beasts lunging forward and back. Through the magnoculars, he could just make out the armored forms of Chaos Marines moving in disciplined formations, a rare, unnerving sight. Usually their assaults came like storms, brutal, chaotic, frenzied. This time, it was precise, controlled. Colonel Serath arrived beside him, her voice raised above the wind and the scream of incoming rounds. They've got siege lines in place, artillery emplacements here, here, and here. She pointed on a hollow projection, and they're not overextending. This isn't a raid. They mean to sit and grind us down. Varn's gut tightened. A patient enemy was far worse than a reckless one. Signal the Casterkin to reinforce Sector 8. I want their best marksmen on the ridge. Serath hesitated just for a fraction of a second. Vera's already deployed them to the outer trench network. Without my order, she claimed she was acting on standing defensive protocols. Varn didn't have time to argue. He opened his Vox, patching directly to Vera's channel. Captain, hold your position until I... Static. Not the harsh, chaotic static of battle damage, but a clean, deliberate cut. The line was dead. Sir, Serath said, her eyes narrowing. We've lost comms with the entire outer trench. A fresh barrage slammed into the walls, close enough to shatter part of the parapet. Shards of ferrocrete clanged off Varn's armor as he ducked, pulling Serath with him. Below, guardsmen scrambled to plug the breach, their movements urgent but still, orderly. Cadia's defenders were no strangers to sudden damage. But then Varn noticed something strange. The trench sector where the Casterkin were deployed remained silent. No las fire, no return barrage, no movement at all. A cold knot formed in his chest. Get me visual on that trench. The pick feed sputtered to life on a portable Auspex unit. For a moment, it showed only the fog, swirling, silver-grey, bending oddly as if some force beneath it was moving the air. Then shapes emerged. Not Cadian. Spiked armor, hulking silhouettes, eyes glowing with malevolence. And at their head, walking as if through a parade, was a figure in black and brass plate. A chaos champion, helm crowned with barbed horns. The Casterkin stood in two neat lines before him. Their weapons were lowered. Emperor's blood, Serath breathed. Varn slammed his fist against the parapet. They've surrendered. Before he could give the order to fire on the position, the champion raised his gauntleted hand and made a single gesture. In unison, the Kasrkin turned and opened fire. Not on the Chaos troops, but on the Cadian defenders in the adjacent trench. The Auspex feed dissolved into static as the Voxnet filled with frantic shouts and screams. "They're inside the kill zones," Serath snapped. "If we open fire now, we'll hit our own men." "They're not our men anymore," Varn growled. "Do it." The fortress guns roared to life, hammering the trench network. Earth and flesh alike were torn apart in the barrage. Through it all, Varn kept his gaze locked on the feed, watching for movement. At the last moment, before the Pict cut entirely, he saw the Chaos Champion lift a struggling figure in Cadian officer's armor, helmet torn away to reveal Captain Vera's face. She wasn't fighting. She was smiling. The fog seemed to deepen with the knowledge. By the time the barrage ended, Sector 8 was nothing but churned mud and bodies. The Black Legion had pulled back, for now. The defenders were left with the ruin, the dead, and the knowledge that the breach had not come from the enemy's guns, but from their own chain of command. In the aftermath, the War Council chamber was a storm of voices. Inquisitor Thalric pressed for immediate purges. Commissar Drain demanded executions without trial. Serath argued for controlled sweeps of the remaining Kasrkin units. Varn let them argue until their voices began to fray, then slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. You think this is the last traitor? You think gutting a handful of squads will fix the rot? This wasn't some random corruption. This was coordinated. Someone is feeding the Black Legion our deployments. Someone at this table." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Thalric bristled. "If you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything," Varn said. "I'm telling you that until we root them out, every order, every movement, every breath we take could be watched." Silence fell. In that silence, the fortress felt smaller, as though its walls had crept inward overnight. That night, sleep did not come. Varn stood again on the battlements, looking out over the darkened plains. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Vera now stood at the enemy's side. He thought of the battles they had fought together, the moments when her voice over the Vox had steadied his hand, the times she had dragged wounded men from the fire. Had it all been lies? Or had she believed once, truly believed, before something in the warp had twisted her? The Eye of Terror pulsed above, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw her silhouette in its swirling light, standing beside the horned champion, both of them watching Cadia as one might watch a candle gutter before it died. He gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. The breach had been made. The next time the Black Legion came, they would not stop at the walls. By the third day after the betrayal at Sector 8, the Black Legion's encirclement was complete. The enemy's artillery did not relent. Each hour brought fresh impacts along the fortress perimeter, not with the chaotic frenzy of an uncontrolled assault, but with the steady rhythm of a clock marking down the minutes of Cadia's survival. Smoke curled over the battlements, and the acrid tang of burning promethium settled into every breath. Inside the fortress, the tension was worse. Patrols marched not just to watch the walls, but to watch each other. The eyes of the guardsmen were rimmed with red from sleeplessness. They gripped their laser guns a little too tightly when fellow soldiers passed in the corridors. Commissar Drain had ordered public executions of 2 men accused of wavering loyalty. But Varn knew the real reason. Fear. Fear was the new oxygen within the walls. The War Council met again in the map chamber, its great hololithic display flickering with the distortion of enemy jamming. "They've pushed armor into the western basin," Serath reported, tracing a line of red sigils. Baneblade patterns, heavily corrupted. "They're digging in for a long siege." We can't weather that indefinitely, Drain snapped. We strike now, break their flank before they tighten the noose. That's suicide, Thalric countered. A frontal counter-offensive plays to their strength. And every time we've moved beyond the walls since Voira's defection, we've been met as though they were expecting us. Which they are, Varn said grimly. Our plans are still leaking. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Thalric's gaze was sharp. We need to assume the spy is still active. Which means any large-scale maneuver will be betrayed before we execute it. Varn finished for him. Yes, I know. Serath leaned forward, voice low. Then we don't make a large-scale maneuver. We make a small one. Quiet. Surgical. We slip a strike team through the old drainage culverts and hit their siege engines from behind before they even realize we're there. Draen gave a bark of humorless laughter. A fine plan, if you don't mind losing every soul you send. The culverts open into no man's land, directly beneath one of their forward redoubts. Which, Serath said evenly, is exactly why they won't expect it. Varn studied the tactical display. Every instinct told him it was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all they had left. How many can you take? 30, maybe 40. Kasrkin only. Men I trust. The word trust hung in the air like a challenge. Varn gave the order. Go. Tonight. Night on Cadia was not true darkness. The eye of terror bled its foul light into the skies, even through the fortress's defense wards. But under that half-light, the strike force assembled in the lower tunnels. Their armor was dulled with ash to reduce reflection, their vox links kept to a tight beam encryption. Varn walked among them, offering the kind of words that were not meant to inspire, but to steal. Cadia had never fought for glory. They fought because there was no other choice. When Serath approached for final confirmation, he clasped her forearm. If you make it through, hit the siege engines hard and fast. Don't linger to count your kills. Every gun you silence buys us hours. She nodded once. We'll buy you more than hours, my lord. They vanished into the culverts, shadows swallowed by deeper shadow. Hours passed. On the battlements, Varn watched the enemy lines. The Black Legion's forward positions burned with constant torchlight, and the glint of their armor shifted like an ocean of steel. Every so often, a flare would streak into the sky, some signaling between warbands, some, perhaps, something else. When the first distant explosions bloomed along the western siege line, a murmur rippled through the fortress. Varn allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. Then came the counterflashes, heavier detonations rippling through the basin. The vox sputtered with bursts of encrypted transmission, then static, then a single voice. This is Serath. Targets neutralized, heavy losses, moving to exfiltration. The message cut off in a scream. Varn's hand tightened around the vox bead. Serath, report. Only static answered. Moments later, the enemy artillery shifted. The basin guns fell silent, not from destruction, but because the Black Legion was redirecting their fire. Shells began slamming into the southern quarter of the fortress, the section directly above the drainage culverts. The walls there buckled under the first impacts. Dust and screams filled the corridors as supports gave way. Varn raced to the breach with a squad of Kasrkin, cutting through rubble-strewn passages until they reached the outer wall. Through the smoke, he saw them. Not Serath's strike force returning, but the Black Legion pouring in. They had used the culverts. Varn realized, with a sick lurch, that the strike mission had not been betrayed after it began. It had been designed for betrayal. The suggestion to use the culverts had been the enemy's move all along, fed into his counsel by a voice he trusted. "Seal this section," he roared. "Purge the corridors, now." The Castkin obeyed, setting demolition charges along the inner choke points. The detonations ripped through stone and steel, collapsing the passages in showers of debris. The enemy advance slowed, but they were inside now, and they would not stop. The War Council reconvened in the upper bastion, their faces pale in the dim light. "The southern quarter is lost," Drain reported. "We've withdrawn to the second defensive ring. But at this rate, Thalric interrupted coldly, "we will be overrun within 2 days, perhaps sooner." Varn stood at the center of the chamber, staring at the flickering map. 2 days. That was if the walls held. Unless there was one option left, an option Cadia had never used in 10,000 years of war. Abandon part of the fortress by choice. If they withdrew entirely to the inner citadel, sealing every approach, collapsing every tunnel, they might hold for weeks. It would mean leaving hundreds of wounded and thousands of civilians outside the inner ring to face the enemy. It would mean sacrificing them to save the core command. He looked at the faces around him. None spoke, but he saw the question in their eyes. Would he do it? Varn's jaw clenched. Begin evacuation to the citadel. Priority to ammunition, water, and command assets. All else, leave. Thalric's gaze was unreadable. And the wounded? Varn did not answer. The order went out. That night, as the gates of the inner citadel closed for the last time, the outer fortress burned. The screams of those left behind rose with the smoke, a sound that would never leave Varn's memory. On the battlements of the citadel, he watched the flames until the first shapes emerged from them. Chaos warriors moving through the slaughter with the slow, methodical pace of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. Somewhere among them, he knew, was Vera, and whoever else still whispered Cadia's secrets into the enemy's ear. The siege was no longer a question of if Cadia would fall, only when. The rain began on the 4th day of the siege. Cold, bitter, relentless. It slicked the fortress walls, turning the shattered trenches below into sucking mud. Men slipped and drowned in water-filled craters. Laspacks fizzled, their charge coils shorting in the damp. Even the air smelled wrong, a coppery tang that spoke of blood and ozone, carried on winds from the warp-tainted guns pounding the southern bastions. Lord Castellan Varn stood over the map table in the command bastion, its surface littered with markers, red for enemy movements, white for Cadian positions, black for areas lost or destroyed. The black markers were multiplying. Commissar Drain slammed another one down. Sector 12 is gone. No survivors. They didn't even fight. They opened the gates. Whole platoon walked out into the dark. Inquisitor Thalric's voice was like a blade. You see, it spreads. Treachery rots through the ranks faster than any shell can tear the walls. We must enact purges now. Every regiment screened, every suspect executed on the spot. Every suspect, Colonel Serath spat. Half the men here have fought 3 wars without leave. They've seen their worlds burned. You think paranoia will keep them loyal? It will keep them breathing, Thalric replied. Varn let them argue a moment longer, listening to the rain hammer against the command spire's windows. The Black Legion was tightening its noose, but their real victory lay in this, the slow splintering of Cadia's will. Enough, Varn said at last. His voice cut through the room like a bolter shot. Purge the traitors, yes, but we do it with proof. And while you hunt shadows, I'll hunt the hand that guides them. A flicker passed between Thalric's eyes. Not fear, but calculation. The Vox operator's voice cracked in. Lord Castellan, urgent communique from Cassararkan, direct from the High Command. Varn's gut tightened. Cassararkan was far from the front lines. The last true fortress city not yet under siege. If they were sending orders now, it could only mean politics. Or something worse. The message scrolled across the hololith in sharp green script. By decree of Lord General Militant Karth Vortigern, overall command of Cadia's defence is hereby transferred from Lord Castellan Varn to Lord General Militant Vortigern himself, effective immediately. All orders are to be routed through his command channel. Any failure to comply will be considered treason. The silence in the room was suffocating. Sirath read it twice before speaking. They're pulling command from you. Now? Thalric's lips curled into something like satisfaction. The High Command recognizes the danger of compromised leadership. Varn ignored him, focusing instead on the signature at the end. Karth Vortigern, a name that had been a shadow in Cadian politics for years. A man more comfortable in the marble halls of the Segmentum Command than on the mud-slick fields of war. The timing was too perfect. The moment Cadia's walls began to crack, Vortigern arrived to claim the ruins, and in his gut, Varn knew. This was no accident. The new orders came within hours. Vortigern's voice over the Vox was smooth, too smooth for a man claiming to be at war. Lord Castellan, or rather Commander Varn, now. You will withdraw forces from the outer bastions and concentrate them in the central keep. I will arrive within the day to coordinate our next move. Until then, no offensive operations are to be undertaken without my direct approval. It was a death sentence. The outer bastions were the teeth of the fortress. Abandoning them would give the Black Legion free ground, letting them set their siege engines against the keep itself. Sirath paced like a caged predator. If we follow this, we're finished. We must hold the outer lines. And if we disobey, Drain growled, we're branded traitors, and in this climate, the men might believe it. Varn stood silent for a long moment, the rain's steady patter filling the room. Then he looked at them both. We hold the lines. If Vortigern wants to court-martial me, he can do it after Cadia still stands. Thalric's eyes narrowed. You're defying Segmentum command. This is beyond dangerous. It is heresy by omission. Varn stepped close enough that the Inquisitor had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. And if Cadia falls because you followed a coward's orders, that will be heresy by action. The Inquisitor said nothing, but the seed of enmity already planted sank deeper. The next day, the storm broke, not the rain, but the siege itself. Before dawn, the southern horizon erupted in a wall of fire. The Black Legion's guns fell silent, replaced by a drumbeat of engines. Out of the fog rolled their armored spearhead, land raiders, predators, demon engines wreathed in chains and living fire. And above them, carried on columns of warp lightning, came the warband's leader. Varn had seen him once before, in the grainy feeds from Sector 8, the horned champion who had claimed Vera. Up close, his armor was a cathedral of blasphemy, every plate etched with screaming faces that seemed to shift and writhe. The champion raised a blade wreathed in dark light, and the assault began. The outer bastions shuddered under the first impact. Cadians held their fire until the engines were in range, then unleashed a storm of lass and bolter fire. For a heartbeat, the assault seemed to falter, and then the traitors inside the walls struck. A Vox channel screamed with warnings. Inner gates opened, ammo dumps sabotaged, fire control systems shut down. In 3 bastions, the defenders turned their guns on their own men. Through it all, the champion advanced, untouched by the storm. Behind him, the black and brass tide poured forward. Varn was everywhere at once, shouting orders over the Vox, rallying broken squads, cutting down Chaos Marines in the breach with his own power sword. Around him, the fortress roared and burned. But in the chaos, a new voice cut into the command channel. Cold, imperious, and achingly calm. "Varn," Vortigern said, "this is why command was removed from you. You cannot control your own fortress. Stand down and prepare to receive my forces. We will negotiate terms of survival with the invaders." For a moment, Varn thought he had misheard. "You would parley with the Black Legion." "They are not here to destroy Cadia," Vortigern replied. "They are here for the Imperium's arrogance, and I will give them what they want in exchange for what we need." The truth hit Varn like a shell to the chest. This was the Rot's heart. Not in the trenches, not in the Kasrakin, but in the gilded halls above. Vortigern wasn't planning to save Cadia. He was planning to hand it over. There was no more time for politics. Varn cut the channel and opened a new one to every loyal unit still standing. "This is Varn. Vortigern is a traitor. Hold your ground, every man and woman of Cadia. If you see his forces, treat them as hostile. This is our world, and we will die before we give it to the Black Legion." The rain swallowed his words, but the guns did not. And somewhere in the fire and fog, the horned champion raised his blade again, not in victory, but in invitation. The wind over the southern wall was colder than it had been the day before. Not the chill of weather, but the creeping cold of an encroaching void. Lord Castellan Varna stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out over the no-man's land. Once, the plain had been clear enough to see the approach of enemy formations. Now, it was a shifting mass of smoke, ash, and strange auroras rippling from the warp-torn horizon. Shapes moved in that smoke, some mechanical, others hunched and many-limbed, their eyes like dying suns. The Black Legion's guns had fallen silent hours ago. That was the worst sign of all. Silence meant they were moving, repositioning, preparing for something greater. Behind him, the fortress was changing. Walls that had stood for centuries were pocked with breaches. Supply corridors stank of blood and burnt ceramite. The air was thick with the hiss of Medicae sprays and the muffled sobbing of soldiers too young to have seen Cadia in its prime. In the command chamber, a circle of officers waited. Serath was there, pale and tight-lipped. Drain leaned forward, gauntlets creaking. Thalric loomed near the map table, his eyes glittering like obsidian. "We've confirmed it," Serath began. "The traitor cells aren't isolated. We've found evidence of coordinated sabotage in the power conduits for the eastern gun decks. Charges planted weeks ago, set to detonate on signal." Varn's gaze sharpened. "Weeks ago?" "Yes, sir. Before the siege lines closed, it meant one thing. The enemy had been inside their defenses far longer than anyone had dared to admit." Thalric's voice was ice. "Purge the sectors. Civilians, auxiliaries, non-essential crew. If you delay, you'll be pulling traitors out of the rubble after they've done their work. And if we purge blindly," Serath snapped, "we'll destroy what little manpower we have left. You can't defend the inner bastions with corpses and empty laser guns. They won't be corpses if they're loyal. They'll be corpses if you force them into the open under heavy fire, Inquisitor." Varn let the argument run for a moment, then cut across it. Enough! You're both right. We'll clear the sectors, but surgically. We can't afford to lose either the guns or the trust of those still willing to fight. Draen grunted approval, though his expression suggested he'd prefer the Inquisitor's more brutal approach. The meeting dissolved into clipped orders and data slate exchanges. But when they were gone, Varn remained by the table, staring at the holographic map. The fortress's defenses were dwindling, red icons spreading like a disease through its outer rings. Every gain for the enemy cost Cadia something it could not replace. A wall section, a supply route, a commander. He remembered something Vera had told him long before the war began. Cadia doesn't fall because it can't imagine falling. Now, that faith was cracking, and when faith cracked, the body followed. The purges began that night. Teams of Kasrkins swept through the eastern bastions, dragging suspected saboteurs into the open. Most were workers or press-ganged civilians, gaunt, terrified, pleading their innocence. Some were shot where they stood. Others were dragged away for interrogation. A few turned their laser guns on the squads without hesitation, confirming the need for the sweep. Varn hated every moment of it. He could feel the fortress itself recoiling from the violence. An ancient bastion, built to repel the alien and the heretic, now bleeding itself out in suspicion and fear. Worse still, the enemy's silence ended. At precisely midnight, the Black Legion's artillery began again, not on the outer walls, but directly on the sectors undergoing purges. Explosions lit the night in sync with the screams of both loyalists and traitors. It was a calculated cruelty, forcing Cadia to kill its own, while the enemy finished what the purges began. By dawn, Sector 12 was gone. Nothing remained but twisted metal and craters filled with fire. On the third day, scouts returned from a foray toward the enemy lines. Or rather, what was left of them. Only 2 of the original 12 made it back, both stumbling, armor shredded, their eyes hollow. "They're building something," one rasped, voice breaking. "Not siege towers, not tanks. Something alive." The other simply shook his head, muttering the same word over and over. "Gate, gate, gate." Thalric took them into custody immediately, claiming possible warp contamination. Varn didn't argue. He had seen enough campaigns to know when a soldier's mind had been broken by something no human should witness. But the word stayed with him. Gate. If the Black Legion intended to open a warp gate within artillery range of Cadia, the fortress would be nothing more than a foothold for a tide of demons. The walls, the bastions, the Kasrkin, none of it would matter against a rift that vomited the eye's horrors into reality. On the 4th night, the enemy struck again. It began with a feint, a probing attack on the southern gate. Bolter fire lit the parapets, heavy stubbers chattering from the shadows. The defenders held, but the assault kept their focus locked forward. The true blow came from within. A section of the inner wall detonated in a fountain of stone and steel. Through the breach poured Black Legionnaires, their armor wreathed in warp light, blades dripping with the essence of something far fouler than blood. And among them, her hair shorn, her armor repainted in the colors of the enemy, came Vera. Varn met her in the courtyard, his power sword flashing as he cut down one traitor after another to reach her. When their blades clashed, it was like striking against a memory. Every motion of hers was one he had drilled into her years ago. "You could have been Cadia's shield," he snarled between blows. "I am its shield," she answered, parrying and riposting with fluid precision. "But the Imperium's shield is rusted through. I serve the future now." Her words were nothing but poison. Yet her eyes, for a flicker of a moment, held something else. Regret, pity, he could not tell. Then she broke away, covering the retreat of her Black Legion escort. The breach was sealed, but not before the enemy left their mark. Half the inner courtyard reduced to rubble, dozens of defenders dead, and the knowledge that the fortress could now be breached from both without and within. By the time the fires were put out, the sky above Cadia was no longer a sky at all. The Eye of Terror had swelled, bleeding colours into the void, its edges crawling with lightning. Varn stood alone at the battlements once more. The walls felt smaller now, as though shrinking under the weight of inevitability. He had always believed Cadia could not fall. That belief had been the bedrock of his life, his career, his every decision. Now he could feel the cracks running through it, widening with every hour. From somewhere deep within the warp's glow, a horn sounded, not the blaring of brass or steel, but a sound like the tearing of the world's fabric itself. And in that sound, Varn heard the truth. The siege was no longer a matter of holding the walls. It was a matter of how Cadia would die. The fortress air was heavy with the smell of oil, blood, and burnt ozone. The enemy's guns had not stopped for 3 days. Not in the daylight hours, not in the black of night. The pounding had become a rhythm, like a heartbeat, except each beat was another stone, another wall, another life shattered. Lord Castellan Varn stood in the inner command bastion, its reinforced walls shuddering with each distant detonation. Around him, the tactical holomap flickered and jittered, struggling to keep up with the constant changes. Every hour, the enemy crept closer. Every hour, Cadia shrank. Colonel Serath was the first to break the tense silence. Sector 12 is gone. We've lost the entire forward redoubt. I've rerouted the 112th Infantry to cover the breach, but they're down to half strength. Half strength and no heavy weapons. Commissar Drain added grimly. They'll hold for an hour, maybe less. Varn's gaze swept the map. The red zones, enemy control, had swollen like a spreading infection. The green of loyalist lines was now a ragged crescent wrapped around the fortress core. And inside that green, tiny black marks, the confirmed traitor cells uncovered by Inquisitor Thalric's purges. But the purges had not stopped the betrayals. Yesterday, a munitions stockpile had detonated deep inside the walls, killing 200 soldiers and collapsing a key supply tunnel. The official report claimed it was a chaos bombardment strike. Varn knew better. "Where's Thalric?" Varn asked. "Interrogating prisoners," Serath replied, "though I suspect he's executing more than he's questioning." "That won't save us," Drain muttered. "Fear only goes so far before men choose the other side." Varna didn't disagree. A sudden, sharp tone from the Vox cut through the council chamber. "Emergency transmission. Casa fortification. Eastern approach." The voice on the other end was ragged, half choked by static. "This is Lieutenant Corval of the 32nd. We're... Emperor, help us. They're inside. Not the enemy. Our own. Half the men just..." A burst of gunfire erupted through the transmission. Screams. Then silence. The holomap updated. The eastern bastion flashed red. Serath slammed her fist into the console. "That's the last direct supply line from the river. We lose that, and we're cut off entirely." "We already are cut off," Varn said quietly. "We just haven't admitted it yet." That night, the sky turned the color of blood. The Eye of Terror loomed huge above the horizon, its swirling storms casting sickly crimson light over the battlefield. The air itself seemed heavier, harder to breathe, as if the warp was pressing down on the planet. From the battlements, Varn watched the enemy advance in the distance. Slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Their banners flickered in the wind, black fields marked with the twisted star of chaos. In front of them marched the traitors, once Cadian soldiers, their uniforms tattered but still recognizable. Among them, even at this distance, he saw her, Captain Vera. No helm now, her hair matted with blood, her eyes lit with a cold, alien light. She walked beside the horned Chaos Champion, speaking to him as one commander to another. Serath joined him at the wall. If we had a strike wing left, I'd take her head myself. You'd never get close, Varn replied. Serath was silent for a moment. She knows every inch of these defenses, every blind spot, every fallback position. I know, Varn said. That's why she's still alive. At midnight, the infiltration began. The first sign was the gate locks failing, not blasted apart, not burned through, but disengaging from within. The inner portcullis groaned open just enough to let a single file of soldiers pass. At first, they looked like Cadians returning from patrol. Then the sentries realized the faces under the helmets were wrong, too pale, too still, and the eyes, black pools reflecting nothing. The alarm went up, but it was already too late. Chaos Marines surged through the breach, cutting down defenders in a storm of bolter fire. Behind them came the traitor guardsmen, firing into their former comrades without hesitation. Varn's orders came rapid fire over the Vox. Seal Gate 3, redirect 2nd Company to the courtyard, hold the inner causeway at all costs. The fortress interior became a maze of close-quarter firefights. Bolter rounds tore chunks from the walls. Lars fire lit the corridors in strobing flashes, the screams of the dying mingling with the roar of war. Varn fought in the thick of it, his power sword cutting down a Chaos Marine with a sweep that sent black ichor splattering across the stone. Serath fought beside him, her rifle's stock cracked, her armor dented, her voice hoarse from shouting orders. They managed to seal the breach after 30 brutal minutes. But the cost was staggering. Entire squads wiped out, ammunition stores drained, and worst of all, the knowledge that the enemy had walked through their gates with barely a shot fired. When the fighting died down, Varn called what remained of the War Council. We cannot win this by holding the walls, he said flatly. Every day we sit here, they bleed us from within. If we stay, we die slowly. Drain frowned. And your alternative? Run into the teeth of the Black Legion? Varn pointed to the map. They're pulling their forces tight around us, but their supply lines to the north are stretched thin. If we can break out, we can cut them, force them to split their attention. You're talking about leaving Cadia's last fortress undefended, Serath said. I'm talking about keeping Cadia alive, Varn replied. A fortress is stone. Cadia is people. And right now, those people are dying behind these walls. Thalric, finally returned from his purges, leaned forward. You'll need a spearhead. Something fast. Something they won't expect. Varn's eyes met Serath's. You and I will lead it. Later, alone in the darkness of his quarters, Varn found his hands shaking. Not from fear of the battle ahead, but from something worse, doubt. Was he leading Cadia to salvation, or abandoning its heart to the enemy? As he stared out at the blood-red sky, he thought again of Vera, of the day she had stood beside him on the walls, and sworn that Cadia would never fall. He wondered if she would be smiling when they met again, sword to sword, on whatever battlefield the Emperor still granted them. The guns began again at dawn, and the siege entered its final hours. The air hung heavy with the acrid scent of promethium and dust. thick and choking beneath the shattered battlements of Qasr Murak. Twilight bled slowly over the ruined fortress, casting long shadows that writhed like restless spirits. Lord Castellan Varric moved swiftly through the corridors, his armor scraping faintly against broken stone, the weight of command pressing ever harder. The recent losses gnawed at him. The failed strike team, the sabotage that had crippled their defenses, and worst of all, the betrayal festering within their own ranks. An emissary approached, breathless, bearing a data slate flickering with intercepted transmissions. Varric's eyes narrowed as he listened to the ghostly voice that seeped from the device. Words of despair and dark certainty, proclaiming Cadia's fall was inevitable, that the fortress was already lost. The message had not come from the enemy's front lines, but from deep within the fortress itself, an insidious whisper meant to fracture hope. Scouts traced the signal to an abandoned mining shaft, a place long forsaken and crawling with shadows. When a small team was dispatched to investigate, they returned with chilling news. The bodies of 3 engineers lay sprawled, their throats cruelly slit, eyes wide in mute horror. No transmitter was found, yet the message had played again and again, a spectral echo in the corridors. The Inquisitor, her face a mask of cold determination, saw this as proof of a vast conspiracy, a worm at the heart of Qasr Murak, twisting loyalties and seeding doubt. Varric stood at the edge of a precipice, torn between ruthless purges and preserving the fragile unity of his forces. The fortress was no longer merely a bastion against the enemy. It had become a crucible of fear and suspicion. As the ash storms rolled back across the battlements, shadowy figures flitted at the edge of vision, vanishing when approached. Ammunition stores were found sabotaged. Trusted officers eyed one another with growing distrust. A message carved into the cold stone outside Varric's quarters chilled him to the bone. Your most trusted hand will strike the killing blow. The true war was no longer fought with bolter and blade. It was a war of shadows, whispers, and broken oaths. And in the gathering gloom, Varric knew the fortress's soul was slipping through his fingers like smoke. The walls of Qasr Murak, once proud and defiant, now seemed to breathe shadows. Lord Castellan Varric moved through the twisting corridors with a weight upon his shoulders, heavier than the ceramite plates of his armor. The fortress was fraying at the edges, not from the battering of the Black Legion's siege engines, but from the corrosion within. Sickness that spread through whispered doubts and fractured loyalties. He passed by squads of weary Kasrkin, their faces gaunt beneath the weight of sleepless nights and creeping fear. The purges decreed by the Inquisitor had stripped the fortress of trusted officers. Friends turned suspicious eyes on friends. Men who once stood shoulder to shoulder now lurked in the shadows, waiting for the other to falter. Varric's own command staff was reduced to a handful. Colonel Seren, a man whose grizzled face bore the scars of decades of war, greeted him with a grim nod. Lord Castellan, he said, voice low. The loyalists are holding, but the enemy's whispers poison more than just the air. The men are unraveling. Unraveling, Varric echoed. Fear is a blade that cuts both ways. We must find the source of this poison before it tears us apart. The Inquisitor Thalria had long since withdrawn to her secret interrogations, rumoured to extract confessions by means both cruel and unnatural. Varric both feared and loathed her methods. She was relentless, unyielding, a blade that cut to the bone but risked severing the arm. Reports came in of sabotage, fuel reserves drained overnight, a key servo-hydraulic pump crippled, communication systems faltering without explanation. Every system was a thread, and the threads were snapping. Then came the hardest truth. The traitor was within his own inner circle. A messenger approached Varric with trembling hands. "Lord Castellan, we intercepted a transmission. A voice known to us, Captain Veyra's. She speaks to the enemy, coordinates the attacks. Her betrayal is complete." Varric's stomach turned. Veyra, once his most trusted captain, his brightest star among the Kasrkin, now a harbinger of doom, wielding her intimate knowledge of the fortress like a weapon against her own blood. He recalled the day she left, armored in the colors of Cadia, eyes blazing with cold fury. "I serve the future," she had said. The words haunted him like a dirge. Varric summoned his remaining officers for counsel. The fortress will not hold if the enemy knows every secret path, every blind spot. We must purge the inner sanctums. We must find the traitors and end this. Sergeant Kalen, a veteran whose loyalty was beyond question, spoke quietly. "Lord Castellan, I have a proposition. A strike team, small, swift, to hunt Veyra and her collaborators. We take the fight to them, disrupt their plans before the next assault." Varric nodded slowly. "You will lead it. You have my trust." As the night deepened, Varric retreated to the battlements, gazing out at the eye's ominous swirl. The warp storm had grown, a malignant wound on reality's flesh. He thought of the sacrifices that had brought them here, centuries of blood and iron, the legacy of 1,000 fallen heroes. And he thought of the choice before him, to stand and fight a doomed defense, or to strike at the heart of the traitors and risk everything. A distant horn sounded, a call to arms, or perhaps a requiem. The answer, he knew, would come in fire and blood. The ruins beneath Casa Mirak were a tomb. Fissures ran like scars across shattered stone, and broken conduits hummed with unstable power. Where once ancient temples had risen, only shattered pillars and desecrated statues remained, the bones of a forgotten faith. Sergeant Kalen led his strike team through the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the fortress, the air thick with dust and the faint tang of ozone. Each step echoed in the oppressive silence, broken only by the soft clatter of boots and the nervous breathing of the men. "The transmissions came from here," Kalen whispered, gesturing to a ruined chamber where the walls still bore glyphs long eroded by time. They used these tunnels to move unseen. The flickering light of their flares revealed signs of recent activity, scorched marks, footprints, hastily abandoned equipment. Suddenly, a faint voice echoed, a whisper carried on the stagnant air. "Cadia is lost," it breathed. "Your sacrifices mean nothing. We bring a new dawn." Kalen raised his last pistol, signaling the men to spread out. The words haunted the chamber like a curse. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure cloaked in shadow darted through a broken archway. "After her," Kalen ordered, and the team surged forward, bolters raised. The chase twisted deeper into the tunnels, the air growing colder and the passages narrower. They emerged into a vast cavern, lit by strange warp light that pulsed like a heartbeat. There, standing amidst a circle of ancient runes, was Captain Veyra. Her eyes gleamed with unnatural fire, her voice ringing with cruel certainty. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Before Kalen could react, tendrils of warp energy erupted from the runes, wrapping around the team in searing flames of shadow. The men screamed, fighting the invisible bonds, but one by one they fell. Kalen drew his combat knife, slashing blindly at the air until the last tendril cut through his armor and sent him crashing to the stone floor. Darkness closed around him as Veyra's laughter echoed through the cavern. cold, triumphant, eternal. Back on the surface, Lord Castellan Varric received the news with a heavy heart. "We lost the strike team," Serath reported, eyes rimmed red. "Only Kalen made it back, barely conscious. And Vera?" Varric's voice was barely audible. "She's deeper in the enemy's grasp than we feared," Serath said. "The warp is corrupting her, or perhaps she always walked its path." Varric's fists clenched. Every loss tore at his soul, but the fortress itself was bleeding more than men. Within the walls, whispers of rebellion grew louder. Soldiers spoke of surrender, of bargains with the enemy, of the futility of their fight. The Inquisitor Thalria's purges intensified, her shadow stretching over every corner of Castra Mirac. Yet even she could not stem the tide of despair. Varric wandered the empty halls at night, haunted by the ghosts of the fallen and the faces of those who had betrayed them. He pondered the terrible price of survival, what sacrifices were too great, what loyalties could not be broken, and whether the Emperor's light still shone upon them at all. As the eye of terror boiled overhead, he knew one truth remained. The war was no longer for a fortress, but for the very soul of Cadia itself. The fortress seemed to pulse with unease, a living thing caught in the grip of desperation. Lord Castellan Varric walked through the dimly lit corridors of Castra Mirac, the weight of command pressing down on him with every step. The fortress no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a crucible, forging the broken wills of its defenders in a fire of suspicion and dread. In the War Council chamber, faces once filled with resolve now bore the marks of exhaustion and doubt. Colonel Seren's jaw was clenched tight. Even the veteran's unshakable exterior was cracking. "We cannot continue like this," Seren said quietly. "Every day we fight not just the Black Legion, but our own shadows. Morale is shattered. Men no longer trust their commanders, let alone each other." Serath nodded grimly. "The purges have done more harm than good. Fear breeds betrayal, but it also kills loyalty." Varric's gaze fell to the holomap glowing in the center of the room. The red tide of enemy control had pushed deeper into the fortress, but the true threat was no longer outside the walls. "We face enemies without and within," Varric said. "If we are to survive, we must face the truth of our own fractures." That night, Varric summoned the remaining trusted officers to a clandestine meeting beneath the fortress, a place untouched by the warp's corruption, a sanctuary in the ruins. Among them was Captain Ilara, once a pupil of Vera and now sworn to the Castellan's cause. "We must root out the traitors, but without turning Castra Mirac into a graveyard," Ilara said softly. "Our enemies seek to divide us. We must remember what holds us together." Varric nodded. "The oaths we swore, to the Emperor, to Cadia, they are the light we must follow." But even as they spoke, the spectre of betrayal loomed large. Late into the night, whispers crept through the corridors. A shadow moved unseen, striking at those who still dared to hope. Officers found dead, their throats slit or their minds shattered beyond repair. The fortress was bleeding its soul. Varric stood alone in his quarters, staring at the fading stars through a cracked viewport. Immortality, the promise once whispered to the great leaders of Cadia, seemed a cruel joke now. To live and watch everything fall apart, to witness friends become enemies, to fight a war with no end. He closed his eyes and saw Vera's face, her smile cold and distant. Was she a traitor or a prophet of a new order? Had she chosen a future he could not see? The questions burned, unanswered. The horns sounded again, low, mournful, carrying across the fortress like a dirge. The final battle was coming. The first light of the dying sun seeped through the cracked skylights of Casa Mirac, casting long shadows across the shattered battlements. Lord Castellan Varec stood silent on the parapet, watching the horizon burn red. The eye of terror had swollen beyond all precedent, a malevolent storm that darkened the skies and twisted the very fabric of reality. Below, the defenders of Cadia prepared for what might be their final stand. The walls were lined with exhausted soldiers, their faces set with grim determination, but their eyes betrayed the weight of unspoken fear. Inside the fortress, the halls thrummed with uneasy whispers. The betrayals of the past weeks had left scars deeper than any artillery strike. Trust was a fragile currency, and few held any coin. The Inquisitor Thalria paced the war chamber, her voice sharp as a razor. The time for subtlety has passed. The traitors within will be purged by fire and blood. Only then will the Emperor's light shine true. Varec's voice was steady but weary. We cannot sacrifice Cadia's soul in a blind fury. Our people are our strength. She turned, eyes blazing, and our enemies exploit weakness. Do you choose loyalty over survival, Castellan? Before Varec could answer, a sudden alarm shattered the tense silence. Vox reports flooded in. The Black Legion had begun their final assault. The gates shuddered under the onslaught of siege engines. Thunderous blasts tore at the walls, sending stone and dust raining down. Varec rallied the defenders, shouting orders that were half drowned in the cacophony of war. Every corridor, every tower became a battlefield. Amidst the chaos, Captain Alara led a desperate counterattack against a breach in the southern wall. Her squad fought with the fury of the Emperor's wrath, but the enemy pressed on, relentless and cruel. Varec found himself face to face with the inevitable. The fortress's fall was no longer a question of if, but when. In the dim recesses of the command hall, the Inquisitor initiated a brutal purge, condemning suspected traitors to flames. The screams echoed like a dirge, a mournful song for a dying world. Yet even in the midst of destruction, moments of humanity flickered. A soldier shielding a wounded comrade, a whispered prayer, a fleeting embrace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, blood mingled with tears and fire. Casa Mirac's fate hung in the balance, a fragile thread stretched taut between despair and defiance. The night was drowned in fire and ash. Casa Mirac was a crucible of death, its walls cracked and bleeding, yet still standing, a monument to stubborn defiance. Lord Castellan Varec moved like a ghost through the ruins of the command chamber, his armor scorched and dented, his mind weighed down by the cost of every decision made and unmade. Captain Ilara lay gravely wounded, her breaths shallow, but eyes burning with unwavering loyalty. "The fortress cannot hold much longer," she whispered. "We must break the siege, or die trying." Varec clenched his fists. The traitors had dug their claws deep, and now the enemy closed in from every side. Then the final betrayal came from within his closest circle. A trusted aide, Commander Helion, revealed himself as a servant of chaos, his words dripping with venomous conviction. "Cadia's fall is inevitable," he spat. "Join us, Castellan. Embrace the future, or perish with the past." Varec's sword clashed against Helion's cursed blade, the sparks illuminating a war not just of steel, but of souls. "You have broken your oaths," Varec growled. "You will answer for this." Helion laughed, cold and hollow. "Oaths? They are chains. Chains I have broken." Their duel echoed through the shattered halls. a desperate ballet of light and shadow. Outside, the enemy breached the inner sanctum, the Black Legion's war cries mixing with the roar of crumbling stone. Varric made his choice, not for victory, but for survival. He ordered a retreat, a breakout through the enemy lines to preserve what remained of Cadia's spirit. As he departed, he cast one last look at the burning fortress, a silent vow in his heart to return, or to die trying. The skies above Casar Murak burned like a dying star. Flames licked the crumbling ramparts, and smoke twisted into the blood-red clouds of the Eye of Terror, a grotesque mirror to the devastation below. Lord Castellan Varric stood amidst the shattered remnants of his command, the weight of loss etched deeply into his features. Survivors gathered in ragged bands, their faces marked by grief and fury. They were ghosts of the fortress, clutching to the fragments of hope that remained. Captain Alara, though grievously wounded, stood tall beside Varric, her voice steady. "We are Cadia's last light. If we fall, so does the last hope for this sector." Varric's gaze swept the battlefield, a field littered with the broken and the fallen, where once proud banners now lay torn and stained. The enemy pressed their advantage, the Black Legion's forces closing in like a dark tide. In the heart of the fortress, the Inquisitor Thalria enacted her final decree, a purge not of traitors, but of those too broken to fight, sending them to mercy or oblivion. Varric knew the cost. The cost of survival was a price few were willing to pay. As the last defenders prepared for the final stand, Varric made a decision born of desperation and resolve. He would lead a strike through the enemy lines, not to reclaim the fortress, but to secure a future. With a heavy heart, he bid farewell to those who could not follow, promising they would not be forgotten. The breakout was a storm of violence and sacrifice, a desperate bid against the encircling darkness. Amidst the chaos, Varric glimpsed the ghost of Vera, no longer an enemy, but a symbol of the price paid for ambition and betrayal. Their paths crossed one final time, blades clashing beneath a sky bleeding fire. Neither would survive, but their fight carved a legend, a testament to the tragedy of Cadia's fall. The dying sun bled its last light over the shattered plains surrounding Casar Murak. The fortress, once the unyielding heart of Cadia, was now a tomb, walls broken, fires smouldering, silence thick with the echoes of sacrifice. Lord Castellan Varric stood amid the ruins, his armour scorched, his body weary beyond measure, but his spirit unbroken. Around him, the few survivors clung to life like flickering candles in the encroaching dark. He thought of the centuries past, of empires rising and falling, of heroes born and forgotten. Immortality had promised eternity, but all it delivered was endless witnessing of decay and loss. Vera's face haunted him still, a ghost of betrayal and hope entwined. Her choices had torn Cadia apart, but her fire had also forged the legacy they now bore. As the Black Legion's forces tightened their grip, Varric made his final stand, not for glory or victory, but for memory, that what had been lost would not fade into oblivion. The battle was a tempest of fury and despair. Each breath drawn was a defiance against the dark, and when the last sword fell, when the final light flickered and died, Varric whispered a prayer for the fallen, for Cadia, and for a future born from the ashes. In the end, the fortress crumbled, but its spirit endured, carried in the hearts of those who remembered, who would tell the tale of courage, sacrifice, and the cost of immortality. The stars above faded to black, the galaxy turning as it always had, uncaring and eternal. But somewhere in that endless night, the echoes of Cadia's last light burned still. a beacon for those who dared to hope. The air hung heavy, with the acrid scent of promethium and dust, thick and choking, beneath the shattered battlements of Castra Murak. Twilight bled slowly over the ruined fortress, casting long shadows that writhed like restless spirits. Lord Castellan Varric moved swiftly through the corridors, his armor scraping faintly against broken stone, the weight of command pressing ever harder. The recent losses gnawed at him, the failed strike team, the sabotage that had crippled their defenses, and worst of all, the betrayal festering within their own ranks. An emissary approached, breathless, bearing a data slate flickering with intercepted transmissions. Varric's eyes narrowed as he listened to the ghostly voice that seeped from the device. Words of despair and dark certainty, proclaiming Cadia's fall was inevitable, that the fortress was already lost. The message had not come from the enemy's front lines, but from deep within the fortress itself, an insidious whisper meant to fracture hope. Scouts traced the signal to an abandoned mining shaft, a place long forsaken and crawling with shadows. When a small team was dispatched to investigate, they returned with chilling news. The bodies of 3 engineers lay sprawled, their throats cruelly slit, eyes wide in mute horror. No transmitter was found, yet the message had played again and again, a spectral echo in the corridors. The Inquisitor, her face a mask of cold determination, saw this as proof of a vast conspiracy, a worm at the heart of Castra Murak, twisting loyalties and seeding doubt. Varric stood at the edge of a precipice, torn between ruthless purges and preserving the fragile unity of his forces. The fortress was no longer merely a bastion against the enemy. It had become a crucible of fear and suspicion. As the ash storms rolled back across the battlements, shadowy figures flitted at the edge of vision, vanishing when approached. Ammunition stores were found sabotaged. Trusted officers eyed one another with growing distrust. A message carved into the cold stone outside Varric's quarters chilled him to the bone. Your most trusted will strike the killing blow. The true war was no longer fought with bolter and blade. It was a war of shadows, whispers, and broken oaths. And in the gathering gloom, Varric knew the fortress's soul was slipping through his fingers like smoke.